In the previous video, Shin discovered that the protagonist can see the sword embedded in his chest, so when she claimed to be the goblin's bride, it wasn't in vain. Now a confusing feeling spreads through his body, as the man who long sought his end is not sure if he really wants to leave this world. Meanwhile, Untak will stay a few days in a suite because she has no place to live, and the goblin wouldn't leave her on the street, I suppose. Diakwa's grandfather made it clear to him that all of Untak's wishes should be fulfilled, as something very important depends on the girl. When the man questions what that might be, the grandfather jokingly says it's about Diakwa's credit card, but since the man isn't very bright, he actually believes it. Thus, Diakwa goes home furious to talk about the future of his expenses being in the hands of a stranger to his uncle. However, when he arrives, he finds the goblin and the Grim Reaper taking medication to de-stress. We already know Shin's problem, but the Grim Reaper's revolves around Sunny. The man still doesn't understand why he started crying when he saw the ring and the woman. In the following days, the protagonist receives many things she never had access to before in her life, and one of them, which Untak would like to remove from her routine if she could, is getting a ride from Diakwa to school. As we know, the girl is already the target of jokes, and drawing more attention by going out with an heir is not something she desires. But the man's grandfather made sure to have someone watch over the protagonist to ensure his grandson is doing a good job. Diakwa is slow to connect the dots, only now does he realize that Untak is the goblin's bride and also the girl whose aunt and cousins Shin bribed with gold to stop bothering her. Speaking of them, when the woman tried to sell it, the police were called because everything indicated it was stolen, and at the station, none of the three could remember the protagonist's name or their former address. Returning to Diakwa, the man talks to the Grim Reaper about what worries him, and he thinks this might not be the first time his and the woman's destinies have crossed. This is a great theory to consider, but moving on, the goblin takes the Grim Reaper's place just once at the tea house because a boy he helped years ago, whom Shin always hoped would achieve his dreams, reached the end of his life, and the goblin wanted to be there to guide him to the next path. Meanwhile, the protagonist starts thinking Shin hates her because since she proved she can see the sword, the man hasn't appeared. However, later, the goblin shows up in her suite after being summoned, and since he's not handling his feelings well, he starts drinking whatever alcohol is available. Untak complains about feeling abandoned, but after things calm down, they go to a convenience store to buy some things for her new home. Shin ends up getting drunk, acting a bit differently, and even reveals part of why the goblin's bride is a crucial piece of the puzzle. The protagonist learns she will eventually have to remove the sword from the goblin's chest, but instead of saying it would end his life, Shin just says it would make him more handsome. So, Untak agrees with him that they will perform the sword removal on the first snow. The next day, as soon as the goblin regains his memory of the previous night, he freaks out for having revealed the sword's secret to the protagonist. Meanwhile, Untak deals with her classmates bothering her for getting a ride from a man who seems rich, but with the help of her ghost friends, the leader of the group gets into trouble with the school administration. But the day gets even better for the protagonist because Shin picks her up from school, and then they go to another country, Canada again, just to have a meal together. Then they talk in a square where the goblin shows that instead of carrying a wand as told in tales, he uses a sword in his hands. At one point, Untak leaves Shin there with a book that was hers for him to read and goes to another place where she writes a letter and then places it in a box. Since I haven't watched the entire drama, I'll guess it's a letter to the university from which she borrowed a book the last time she was in the country. When she returns, the man is reading the book she gave him, and he closes it upon seeing the protagonist radiant in the sun, which reminds him of the day he lost his life and was cursed. Thus, the two soon return to Korea and say goodbye. However, when Untak is returning to the suite, on the way, one of her ghost friends asks her a favor which the protagonist fulfills, and then we see the same ghost at the Grim Reaper's tea house. Having resolved the issues keeping her in this world, she can now move on to the next step. The next day, the Grim Reaper accidentally meets Sunny, and the two have coffee together after the woman insists. However, the man doesn't know how to flirt or converse, he simply doesn't know how to act, and somehow this attracts Sunny. But their meeting ends when the woman asks his name, and since he doesn't remember, he just leaves. Meanwhile, Untak is reprimanded by Diakwa for the bill from the suite expenses. It turns out the ghost asked the protagonist to fill her fridge so her mother wouldn't be sad when visiting her room after the funeral and seeing she wasn't eating well. Thus, since Untak didn't have money, she decided to use what was in her room, and now the man wants her to pay for the expense. The protagonist can't do that at the moment, and later her help arrives because the goblin comes to the suite, telling Untak to pack her bags as she will now live with him. Upon arriving at the residence, the girl discovers the goblin's name is Kim Shin. And since there isn't a room prepared for her yet, Untak spends the night in the goblin's room while he shares the Grim Reaper's room. In the room, the protagonist finds a book with some characters she doesn't know yet, and going back to the past, we discover it was written by Shin. I believe it's a kind of diary, not in the childish way we know, where the man recorded the things he saw in these 900+ years he has been alive. Switching to the boys' room, we learn that neither of them has actually seen the Almighty's face, and the Grim Reaper envies humans who know him. The next day, Untak goes to her classes and leaves her phone number in a note for them to call if they need anything. However, neither the Grim Reaper nor the Goblin has a cell phone, so they get one, as the Grim Reaper also has that pending call to Sunny. Watching them learn to use it is very funny. Meanwhile, the protagonist takes the opportunity to research Shin's past, and the only thing she discovers is that the man was a general. Later, Untak joins the Goblin, and they go to a store to buy some things she needed to get comfortable in her new room. But when the girl arrives home, she's surprised to find it fully furnished, and she loves it. Subsequently, the Grim Reaper knocks on her door and asks Untak for help. It's about him not having a name, so since she's the closest to a woman, he asks which male name she likes best. In the end, the Grim Reaper chooses one with the girl's help, which is Wubin. In the following days, our protagonist is focused on studying for the upcoming entrance exams. To help her, the goblin sends her some snacks with notes that always remind her she still has to remove the sword from Shin's chest. However, Untak is increasingly delaying the act because she's afraid the man will discard her afterward. Meanwhile, the Grim Reaper is gathering the courage to call Sunny when Diakwa and the goblin enter the room to bother him. The two end up calling the woman, and improvising, he manages to arrange a meeting with her, where Sunny will bring a friend, and the Grim Reaper will bring Diakwa. Meanwhile, the protagonist and Shin go to a restaurant, but something strange happens when they enter the establishment. The goblin couldn't see much of Untak's future, but suddenly an image of her at 29 appeared to him, and he wasn't by her side, indicating the man will meet his end. In the next scene, we see the Grim Reaper's meeting, and since Diakwa is an outgoing heir, he ends up attracting more attention from the women. This generates some jealousy in the man, who, despite not understanding his feelings for Sunny, didn't like her striking up a conversation with Diakwa. Thus, he makes his companion and her friend leave the table with his powers, then the Grim Reaper erases Sunny's memory of what just happened, and they continue the conversation. The woman asks for Diakwa's number because she realized he's her landlord, and Sunny has some pending matters. But in the end, the meeting goes better than their previous ones, and the man gives her the ring they once disputed. In this interval, the protagonist and Shin return home, where she asks him what happened when he was a general because it seems someone tried to erase his history. The goblin gives a brief summary, saying that someone he never expected embedded the sword in his chest and that before that, many innocents lost their lives because of the choice he made to end the king, which is why he carries this burden in his body today. The protagonist doesn't think it's really a curse because she believes that if the Almighty wanted exactly that, he wouldn't have granted him punitive abilities or a bride. But we have to consider that Untak doesn't really know what happens when the object is removed. At work, her ghost friends appear, and an older lady among them asks the protagonist to get the winning lottery numbers so she can pass them on to her son and be at peace. Despite Untak ignoring her at first, the girl ends up asking the goblin in exchange for removing the sword so she can also win some amount. However, being a minor, the protagonist couldn't even buy the number ticket. And when the goblin finds her, he says that not even the lady's son got them because since the man works at night, he didn't have time to sleep for the woman to appear in his dreams and tell him the numbers. Anyway, Shin explains that he'll find a way for the man to receive help from his guardian, and thus, the woman can rest. In the next scene, we see that beautiful woman who was once the lady who took care of the protagonist when she was little, and when she touches a sick child, the little one seems to get better. My guess is that she's a guardian of children, but we'll see later if I'm right. And the protagonist got a few days off work to study more for the entrance exam. Untak didn't even ask the woman for this, she took the initiative after seeing the exams approaching in the news. Later, after an argument, the goblin arranges a day with the protagonist for the sword to be removed, and before the date arrives, Shin says goodbye to Diakwa's grandfather and the man, even returning the credit card to him. Meanwhile, Untak is searching for those characters she saw in the book in Shin's room to try to decipher what was written. Suddenly, the goblin knocks on her room door with several gifts, and after she opens them all, the two go to a field, the same one where he picked the bouquet for her when they met, for the sword to be removed there. This field is the same where the general's body remained, and he received the curse. The man wants to end his life where it all began. Before it happens, the protagonist gives him an improvised contract about him committing not to discard her after the sword is removed, and the goblin signs it. It soon starts to snow, as they had previously agreed, and when the big moment arrives, Untak simply can't perform the act because, although she sees the object, she can't touch it. So, like in the books, the protagonist thinks it's a spell cast on the Prince Charming, which will break with a kiss, but that's not what happens. Thus, when they return home, the goblin asks for all the gifts he gave to the protagonist, the Grim Reaper, and Diakwa back, but none of them want to return them. What did you think of these episodes? I hope you enjoyed the summary. Leave your suggestions in the comments and subscribe. If you liked the video, like and share it to help me out. Until next time.